Hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I'm your host, as always, Nathan, and today I'm coming at you with a reaction to Week 10 from the Big Ten's perspective. As always, we're going to break down every single team and say at least one thing about them. But before we get into the video itself, it is at this time I am going to ask you to like, comment, and subscribe on this video here. It would really help out the channel if you did so. And now with the intro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to do, and that is to get started by starting with the Treading Water tier. There are 6 teams in the Treading Water tier this week. They are here because their play this weekend did not change my opinions about their team. We're going to go ahead and start over here on the left. Northwestern and Purdue, they played each other. I thought Northwestern would win the game fairly easily, but it didn't surprise me that it ended up being close. Northwestern did win. Purdue did put somewhat of a fight up. There's just not a whole lot that I can take away from that game for either of these two teams here. Purdue is not going to make a bowl game. I believe they are ineligible for a bowl game. Northwestern, it's unlikely you're going to get to that point. You have 3 games left against Ohio State, Michigan, and Illinois. I'm not sure you win any of them, let alone 2 of the 3 to get to a bowl game. Either way, I don't think you should move on from Braun, the head coach, or anything like that. I think he is about as good as you're going to be able to get at this program right now. I believe that you could end up having some relative success in future years with Braun as the head coach. As far as Purdue goes, you will most likely be looking for a new head coach after this season. Ryan Walters might end up getting a pretty good DC job somewhere, but he pretty clearly has just not been a very good hire for this team. I was high on him when he came from Illinois. I really liked Ryan Walters. However, he has not performed very well for you guys. He is very likely to end up getting fired at the end of the season. Speaking of someone who's very likely to end up getting fired, Maryland. You guys had a bye week this week along with Rutgers. Don't really have a whole lot to say about you as you didn't play. You do have 4 games left. You will need to win 2 of them in order to make a bowl game. I'm not sure you get there. I think that's fairly unlikely. I think you've got, relatively speaking, 3 guaranteed losses, and the game against Rutgers is kind of a 50-50 game. As far as Rutgers goes, they might have a slightly easier path to bowl eligibility. They're playing at Minnesota this upcoming week, probably a loss. Then they play Maryland again. That's a 50-50 game. And then they end the season with Illinois and Michigan State. I would lean towards Illinois being able to win that game, and I would lean towards Michigan State being able to win that game as well. But you do have an outside shot at a bowl game if you can beat Maryland. Then all of a sudden you're entering the last game of the season with Michigan State, which would probably end up being a game where the winner gets to go to a bowl game and the loser ends up 5-7 and most likely does not get to go bowling, so to speak. Moving on from the 2 teams that had a bye, we have 2 other teams here on complete opposite ends of the spectrum. Oregon and USC. 2 Pac-12 teams that are playing in the Big Ten for some reason. And we'll go ahead and start with Oregon. There's a very real possibility this is the best team in the country. Heading into this year, I was very high on this team. I thought that that was probably a bad thing, to be honest with you, if you were an Oregon fan and you saw that, because the year before this year, last year, I should have just said last year, I was incredibly high on LSU. I had LSU, I think, preseason number 3 in the entire country. I was very high on LSU last year, and they ended up disappointing. And I felt like that might be the way that it ends up with Oregon. However, that is not the case. This is a focused football team. You do have the injury to the wide receiver, Tez Johnson. It didn't look good, especially how quickly he was ruled out and how quickly he came back on the sideline in street clothes. I think there's a significant possibility it was either a broken collarbone or a dislocated shoulder. I'm recording this Sunday night into Monday morning, so I don't know yet. There's a definitive possibility I could wake up tomorrow morning and know, but I'm not coming back to re-record this, okay? I don't think it's that big of a deal, but when you're losing an NFL caliber wide receiver like Tez Johnson, it is a loss. However, you still have Stewart and you have a plethora of other players that could step up and be really, really good. I think the more important thing is Dylan Gabriel. And as long as you have him, I think you've got a shot. Moving on to the last team in the treading water tier, USC. You lost to Washington. I predicted you to lose to Washington. And this season is lost. This is not a good football team. And this is kind of the way I felt like this season might end up going for you. Now, in my Big Ten preview, I believe I talked about how I could see this team going 9-3 if they end up taking the steps that I thought they might take. And early on in the season, it looked like they were going to take those steps. However, I think this needs to be looked at more as year one of a rebuild than year, 3 or 4 of Lincoln Riley. What I think it needs to be looked at is this is the first year of a rebuild, even though you have a new coach, okay? It is obvious, to me at least, that the problem with this team is a severe lack of defensive talent and, to be honest with you, on the offensive side of the bill, a lack of game planning. I am a firm believer that if Lincoln Riley had said, you know what, fuck the run game, we're going to throw the ball 60 times against Michigan, that you probably win that game handedly. And I think that's, generally speaking, a much better game plan for this team in every game, basically. And even though you've ran the ball effectively, you're not the type of team that's going to be able to outrun Big Ten football teams. At least not yet. I think Lincoln Riley has fallen into the narrative a little bit with this team. I think he's bought into the idea that, oh, we're joining the Big Ten. We've got to play Big Ten bully ball now if we're going to survive. So we need to be really stout on the D-line, and we need to be really stout on the O-line, and we got to run the football on offense. No, not particularly. I think if they had flat out and straight up abandoned the run game against teams like Minnesota that do not have the talent to match up with the wide receivers and the athletes in the receiving room that you have, as well as Michigan, who does have the athletes, but their pass defense is atrocious this year, then I think there's a real possibility you win those games. And this game against Washington was just another example of that playing out. This is a defense that flat out and straight up, in my opinion, just does not have the level of talent that you need in order to have a competent defense at this level. And an offense where the play caller / head coach might have the yips. And I don't know if Lincoln Riley is going to be able to pull this off, but it's pretty clear that Oklahoma is worse for the wear without Lincoln Riley. And the question that I would have for USC fans would be, at what point are you not a coaching hire away? Okay? Josh Pate, who is one of the best college football sort of commentary sort of people on the internet and just in general, he always talked about Texas A&M, and he talked about Texas A&M being a coaching hire away from being an elite program. Now, I think he's wrong about that. flat out and straight up. I don't think they'll ever be in the elite tier. They'll never be better than Alabama. They'll never be better than Georgia. And I think LSU, Florida, and probably Tennessee all have higher ceilings as programs, as well as new entries, Texas and Oklahoma, to the SEC. However, the main point I want to say using that analogy is USC has always sort of been thought of like that they're one hire away from being back to being a powerhouse. And at what point are we going to cycle through coaches and big time hires and realize that you're probably not a coaching hire away and there might be something else going on with this team? And more importantly, this program as a whole. I don't know when you need to start having that conversation, but you're getting pretty close. You're not going to fire Lincoln Riley this year. You're just not. You're probably not even going to fire him next year either. But if he struggles again like this year and last year, next year, you're going to have a lot of people coming for his head. And there's a definitive possibility that that might happen. The next tier is the Scarlett Johansson tier. Why is it called the Scarlett Johansson tier? Well, because these teams looked pretty on Saturday. Let's go ahead once again, start over in the upper left-hand corner. Indiana. Is everybody on board now? Because I've heard everybody talk about this team. Talking about, oh, they haven't played anybody. Yada, yada, blah, blah. Yada, yada, yada. They destroy teams, okay? This is the same conversation that they had with Michigan last year. Not that I think Indiana is of Michigan's level. However, they're going to have an opportunity to prove that 2 Saturdays from now. That being said, I joined the bandwagon pretty quickly. I think it was about week 5 that I really started looking at Indiana as, oh, you're right there. Like, this team is for real. And I think that this team is for real. I think they're going to give Ohio State a run for their money. I think they're going to handle Michigan this week at home. But more importantly, I think they're going to give Ohio State a run for their money 2 weeks from now. Although this week is the most trappy of any trap game that I've seen so far this year for Indiana. All that being said, this is probably the 3rd best team in the Big Ten. And we can only dream of an Indiana-Oregon Big Ten championship game, because that right there is what dreams are made of. Right under Indiana is a team that I have been very critical of this year in UCLA. This win this week was a statement win. Now, Nebraska is not the team we all thought they might be this year. They're further away than we were willing to admit. We got caught up with the hype surrounding the true freshman quarterback, #1 overall recruit, Dylan Raiola. You know, Matt Rule is like a program builder. They were all like, oh, yeah, this is going real well. And then they lost to Illinois. And then they lost, I believe, 3 of their next 4 games after that. So, yeah, Nebraska's a lot further away than we thought they were. Even me, who was not particularly high on them heading into this season. All that being said, UCLA, this is a program-building win. This is a win that next year you can look back at and say, that's where it started. That win right here against a Nebraska team that has more talent than you, hypothetically has a better coach than you, and hypothetically should have won the game. They didn't win the game. You won the game. And you weren't supposed to. Another team that I've also been very critical of, however, they've made a change at the quarterback position, and I am now fully on board with this team, is Iowa. I was very much on the Iowa ain't shit this year bandwagon for the first 6-7 games. And now that Cade McNamara is not the guy at the quarterback position and won't be for the rest of the season, it's going to be Sullivan. I am on board with this team. Sullivan changes this offense. He is better than Cade McNamara throwing the ball, or at least so far, it seems like that is the case. And B, he's a fantastic athlete who gives you something that Cade McNamara could only dream of at the quarterback position. He gives you a legitimate run threat, someone that can break off a big run and scramble for a first down on 3rd and 10 plus. Okay? That is the kind of player that Sullivan is. And that is what this team needs right now. They don't have a whole lot of wide receiver talent. They don't have a very good passing game in terms of numbers and stuff like that. They don't have a whole lot of anything on the offensive side of the ball outside of Caleb Johnson, the running back. So, this team with UCLA, Maryland, and Nebraska left on the schedule has a real good shot to get to 9-3. And I do believe that is what is going to happen. I will likely pick you to win all 3 of those games. However, what changing to Sullivan has done for this team, in my opinion, is given me a relatively large amount of hope for next year. I think this could be a for-real football team next season with him as the quarterback full-time. And looking back on your schedule this year, do you beat Iowa State with Sullivan as the quarterback? I don't know, but I would lean towards yes. Yes, you do. You lost by 1 point, and Cade McNamara effectively lost you that game. He had multiple chances to drive down the field just to get in the field goal range and couldn't do it. Sullivan, I think, would have done it. Genuinely, I believe he would have gotten you that first down. Now, are you going to beat Ohio State? Probably not. Michigan State is a little trickier than the other 2 games. I'm not sure Sullivan helps you a whole lot in that game, because that kind of just felt like it was Michigan State's day, and they were going to win that game. They were coming off of a bye, I believe, and I think that game you still probably lose. However, with Sullivan, I think you win the rivalry game with Iowa State. I think you've got a real chance at 10 wins in the regular season and a outside shot, in all honesty, at the college football playoff. However, that's not what happens, and you've got no shot at the playoff. You run the table the last 3 games here, you might end the season ranked, but that's about all that you can hope for. Pivoting away from a long-winded Iowa segment, we have Minnesota, who is a team that should only have 1 loss, in my opinion. Okay, you lose to Iowa, that's fine. It wasn't a close game. Iowa was the better team that day. You probably were not going to win that game. You should have beaten North Carolina. If your kicker can make a relatively easy field goal, you beat North Carolina. You lose to Michigan by 3 points. Cool. You should have gotten the onside kick. That was a bullshit penalty. You should have gotten the onside kick. You would have easily gotten into field goal range to potentially send the game into overtime, in which case you had all of the momentum, and Michigan had been playing like shit, so you probably win the game. But you also had time to just flat out and straight up score a touchdown if you recovered that onside kick like you should have. So when I talked about the matchup with Illinois, and even though I thought it was going to be a close game, which it was, and I thought Illinois did have a shot to win, which they didn't, but I predicted you to win the game largely because you were a significantly better team than your record led people to believe. This should be a 7-1 team. This should be a team ranked inside the top 20 of all teams in college football. This is a high quality football team this year. And Penn State and Wisconsin have got to pay attention to this game. Now, Wisconsin's going to pay attention. It's a rivalry game. But Penn State, maybe. I'm eyeballing that game 3 weeks from now. Coming off of a bye, too, for Minnesota. Last two teams here are going to talk relatively quickly. Washington, you did exactly what I thought you were going to do. You beat USC. USC was in position late to potentially tie and then win the game with an extra point. You handled business. You won the game. I think you've got the correct head coach in Jed Fisk. I think you're going to adjust to the Big Ten better than USC at least, and potentially UCLA. Not as good as Oregon, because Oregon is that kind of program. However, this could absolutely turn into the kind of team that ends up winning a lot of games in the Big Ten that maybe you wouldn't expect them to win. Kind of the way that Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin have looked the past few years in the remnants of the Big Ten West. Ohio State, everybody knew you were going to beat Penn State. It was ridiculously obvious that you were going to win that game. Even when they shot out to a 10-0 lead, you drove right down the field and scored an easy touchdown. And at that point, the game was effectively settled for me, even though you were down by 3 points. Now, it's also worth noting that Penn State left at least 6 points on the field through sheer stupidity. You look at the play calling on their last red zone drive that they had there, potentially should have, scored to either tie the game or take a lead. And then you look at the end of the second half where they threw an interception on a ridiculous play that the wide receiver absolutely should have fucking caught for a touchdown. And that was a very, very good play by Igmanosin. I'm not taking anything away from him, but that was a gift, okay? I'm not positive this is a great football team. However, I don't think there is a great football team in college football this year. And as we get to my top 15 rankings at the end of this video, you'll probably like what you see if you're an Ohio State fan. Moving on, one of two teams that deserve their own segment all to themselves, Penn State. Oh boy. This is not going to be a discussion surrounding this game versus Ohio State. The question I want to ask you, if you are a Penn State fan, and the question that I am going to explore here, is at what point is moving on from James Franklin a conversation that you start having? Because it's been, 11 years now as the head coach of Penn State? How many big games has he won? Because the answer is, as far as I can remember, 3. You look at the big games that he's played in. You look at 2016 against Ohio State. You look at the 2016 Big Ten Championship game. And you look at the Rose Bowl from 2 years ago, 2 years ago in 2022. Which I might say you only won because Cam Rising got hurt. Utah was winning that game if Cam Rising doesn't get hurt. However, he did get hurt, and you won the game, so that's all that matters. But at what point do you have to sit there and say, we are a good football team that so clearly and obviously has the opportunity to be a great football team? And why can't we get there? Why can't we get over the edge? And you can change the players. You can change the coordinators. You've done both of those things. But you've got to sit here and say, it's got to be James Franklin, right? Like, he's the only thing that's changed. And I understand what you were before James Franklin. Okay, I get that. And you're scared to go back. But The question you need to ask yourself is this: am I okay with not ever winning a Big Ten title again and just ending up with 9, 10, or 11 wins every year? Maybe you make the playoffs one out of every 3 years or so. Am I okay with that, as opposed to potentially taking a risk to being worse, but also potentially being better? Okay? Me personally, I'm a risk taker, generally speaking, because I'm just like, oh, if he sucks, fire him, pay his buyout, go get the next guy. He'll be better. Okay? However, I am also a fan of the second biggest brand in college football with the largest alumni base, and you don't have that. Even though you, well, arguably are the biggest brand in your state. Some people might argue Pittsburgh, but, it's whatever. I do think you are the biggest brand in your state. I think you're bigger than Pittsburgh. But more so than that, this is so clearly a team that could be competing for Big Ten titles and winning playoff games and making playoff appearances. Now, if you handle business against Minnesota, you're going to go 11-1. You're going to be ranked in the top probably 5 most likely, and you're going to make the playoffs. But is going 11-1 in a year where you only play one objectively big time team in Ohio State good enough for you? Are you, if you are a Penn State fan, okay with the idea of your season being predetermined by the schedule you pull? Because that's effectively what you've been under James Franklin, for the most part. If you play Oregon and Ohio State, that's 2 losses. So your ceiling all of a sudden is 10-2. Maybe you play Michigan as well. Maybe Michigan gets good. Maybe Nebraska turns it around and they're better than you too. Maybe USC can. I don't know. But there are a lot of teams that could end up being big-time games now for you. And James Franklin doesn't win big-time games. All right, moving on to the second team that deserves their own little segment here, Michigan. And if you are a Michigan fan, which is the vast probability of you watching this video, you're probably expecting me to go off on this team a little bit. And you're going to be disappointed. I did not particularly see a whole lot in this game that I didn't expect at this point. The fact of the matter is, this is a poorly coached football team with a head coach who does not know what he's doing and 2 coordinators who aren't very good. And I don't know what you want me to say or do beyond that. It's just a fact of reality at this point. I was actually kind of encouraged by the way they played. I get that a lot of Michigan fans are frustrated. That's because they don't understand where this team is right now. They still think this team can beat teams like Oregon. And no, even if every break went Michigan's way, they're not beating Oregon. If Colston Loveland came down with that ball, if Warren threw a better pass to Tyler Morris, and then all of a sudden you've got first down inside the 5. That might be 17 points. Cool. Oregon still scored 38, and there was nowhere else in the game that you were scoring points. This was not a game Michigan was ever going to win. These 2 teams are on different planets. And flat out and straight up, even though the coaching probably cost them, I would say, at least 7, maybe 10 points. This team, with your starting 2 corners hurt and the safety play that we've gotten this year, flat out and straight up, does not have the talent to beat a team like Oregon. If Will Johnson and Jair Hill had played, could they maybe have made some plays on some of the passes that ended up being big plays or on 3rd down or whatever? Yeah, sure. But even then, I still think Oregon would have found a way to win. Okay? So, generally speaking, if the coaching staff is costing you 7 to 10 points, which is what I believe the coaching staff cost Michigan this week, the only remedy you have is to fire the coaching staff. And that's what I want to do. I have effectively been out on the Sherrone Moore era since the loss to Washington. I've given you my pathway back to believing in Sherrone Moore, but that is probably just not going to happen. I do not believe Bryce Underwood is going to commit to Michigan. I think this is a giant troll operation by someone. I don't actually think that Bryce Underwood signing with LSU in the early transfer period and then finding out Garrett Nussmeier's coming back and then entering the transfer portal is not out of the realm of possibility. But the chances of him flipping to Michigan and signing with Michigan on December 4th are zero. And they've always been zero. It doesn't matter that Michigan is now suddenly making him a priority and they're really trying to push for him. That doesn't matter. He's not coming here. And I will not believe that he is coming here until he signs with Michigan, which again, I think the chances of that happening are effectively zero. And to be entirely honest with you, even if Bryce Underwood did sign with Michigan, I still would want a new head coach anyway. This is not a program going in the right direction. This is a program that had a minimum expectation of 8-4, and they are not going to get there. They're not beating Indiana this week. They're not beating Ohio State at the end of the year. The best this team can hope for is 6-6, where you're going to get some bullshit bowl game against some 9-3 MAC school or some shit, and they're going to win the game, and then all of a sudden people are going to be optimistic heading into the offseason. No, I will not be optimistic. I don't care if they fire Kurt Campbell. I don't even actually think he's that bad of an offensive coordinator. I don't even really think the 4th down play call at the end of the game was that bad. It just should have been called on 3rd down. The fact of the matter is that on that play, 10 players on Oregon's defense fell for it hook, line, and sinker. And Mateo Uiagalelei, who not this year but the year after is going to be a first-round pick, made an absolutely incredible play. He read it, and he covered Alex Orji, okay? That's just Oregon having more talent and being better than us. I don't particularly think it was a bad play. I just think it should have been the 3rd down play instead of the run up the middle that didn't do anything. Generally speaking, do I want Kurt Campbell to be back? No, but I've been saying he should be fired for weeks. And it seems like this was the game where now all of a sudden everybody's on board with firing Kurt Campbell. And everyone's like, oh, but Kurt Campbell might be the reason we get Bryce Underwood. We're not getting Bryce Underwood. December 1st, the day after we get our asses obliterated by Ohio State, both coordinators are gone. If that does not happen, I do not have any confidence in Sherrone Moore, and the little modicum of respect I still have for him as a football coach is also gone. To be entirely honest with you, you could probably get away with him firing them the Sunday after Indiana. They have a bye week, and then they play Northwestern. And I think you should probably just move on from both of them. Or if you're not going to move on from both of them, demote their asses. Sherrone take over play calling on defense and give fucking anybody the opportunity for the last 2 games of the season on defense. Another thing that I want to do with this team here, I want you to come back with me. We're going to go back to July, okay? And we're going to say, even if Michigan does go 8-4 and the quarterback play is bad, what are the building blocks of this program? What are the Sherrone Moore things that have to be there, okay? First things first, culture. That's what everybody said. This was a desperate attempt to keep the Jim Harbaugh culture. That culture's gone. It's out the window. It doesn't exist anymore. What was the second thing that Sherrone Moore was going to lean on? The offensive line. Very talented, filled with 4-star and high-quality recruits. including Miles Hinton, who was a 5-star and also a very, very experienced player. The offensive line is one of the 3 or 4 worst in the Big Ten. Okay, the run game. We're always going to be able to run the football. Nope. Run game has been horrible outside of 2 games this year. So those were the 3 building blocks of the Sherrone Moore era. Those were the 3 things that we leaned on even in the dark times. All 3 of those things are gone and out the window. So what in the world are we doing talking about bringing him back for another year? Oh, he's recruiting really well. Then fire him on December 5th. After everybody's already signed their letter of intent, and then you bring the new guy in within 3 or 4 days, have him give his pitch to the recruits. Maybe they stay, maybe they don't. I don't care. This program is heading into a full-blown blow-it-up rebuild next year either way, and I don't believe Sherrone Moore is the guy that's going to get us back to being competitive. There is no real argument to keep Sherrone Moore as the head coach of this football team. Now, all that being said, there's a reason that I haven't dropped a video talking about who I would want Michigan to go after. Okay? The 2 main reasons. Number 1, Florida exists. Florida is going to end their season 4-8 with DJ Langway hurt. However, I'm not sure they fire Billy Napier. I think he kind of got a raw deal. I do think Florida is a team that could have gotten 8 or 9 wins if they were in the ACC or the Big 12 or the Big 10 even. But the reality is that their schedule is effectively a -6 in the loss column. So their best case scenario was always 6-6, and they're not going to get there because Graham Mertz got hurt, so you have to go to the true freshman. And then the true freshman got hurt, and is probably not going to play the rest of the year. So this very well could be the time that you fire Sherrone Moore. And they're not going to, because Ward Manuel and Santa Ono do not know what they're doing. If they knew what they're doing, they wouldn't have hired Sherrone Moore. All of that being said, I thought Davis Warren played really well. We have our quarterback for the rest of the season. As long as he doesn't turn the ball over, he was probably always the best option. But the problem is that he was turning the ball over a lot early on in the season. I'm pretty sure he threw 3 interceptions against Texas, and then he threw 3 interceptions the next week against Arkansas State. You had to bench him. Also, I could do a film breakdown on this. I won't because I don't have time this week. But Davis Warren has improved dramatically, and it's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. He's still not a good quarterback. And no, even though I have been very publicly and openly critical of Cade McNamara, especially at his time at Michigan, no, he is not better than Cade McNamara. Cade McNamara in 2021 was a significantly better quarterback than Davis Warren. Davis Warren does not throw for almost 400 yards and 3 touchdowns against even that poor Michigan State secondary in 2021. He'd be lucky to get to 250. After this team loses to Indiana this week, I am going to effectively start campaigning for us to fire Sherrone Moore, because I do not believe you can defend this season and what has happened to this program. I do not think you can defend it. And again, we talk about the recruiting out of high school. That's his only saving point. Do you not remember how really fucking good at recruiting Brady Hoke was? Brady Hoke was arguably, well, in fact, is inarguably the best recruiting coach Michigan has ever had. The amount of top 100 recruits that he got for a team that objectively sucked ass is staggering. And it didn't matter at all. We still sucked on the field. Some of you Michigan fans are really turning into off-season champs type of fans, and I get that that is the only thing that we've got going for us right now, but I need you to understand how absolutely little that shit matters to me. It means nothing to me. If Sherrone Moore is the head coach next season, which he almost certainly will be, If Michigan is going to be successful, it's going to take two new coordinators who are elite level guys that are going to get poached by programs to be head coaches after 1 year, as well as someone not named Sherrone Moore being in charge of decision making during the game, and also a new special teams coordinator, a new offensive line coach, probably a new defensive line and linebacking coach. The only coach on the staff that I'm actually okay with bringing back is Lamar Morgan, because even though the secondary sucks absolute ass, he is recruiting at a tremendously high level. I believe he's currently ranked in 247 as one of the 10 best recruiters in all of the country. So I'm willing to bring his ass back, but we're going to have to bring somebody in to actually coach the secondary because he's just a recruiter. And at that point, if you have to do all of these things, what you really should be doing is just moving on from Sherrone Moore. Okay? To top it all off, I'm going to say something that is probably going to be controversial in a lot of people's minds. I'm not even really sure how much of Sherrone Moore all of a sudden being really good at recruiting is Sherrone Moore being good at recruiting, or because we've doubled the size of our recruiting staff, hired coaches that can recruit, and also actually gave a fuck about recruiting at a program level. So I'm not even really sure it's Sherrone Moore the reason that Michigan is doing better in the recruiting trail. It's probably just because he's taking it more seriously than Jim Harbaugh ever did. So maybe even the best recruiting, class that we've ever had in the internet era, at least, which is what this class is shaping up to be, isn't really because of Sherrone Moore, and it's probably more just because the program all of a sudden is taking recruiting seriously. So even that selling point, I don't 100% buy into. The fact of the matter is that if Michigan was a real program, they would have cleaned house halfway through this season and then fired Sherrone Moore on December 1st. That's what a real program that actually cares about winning and can actually use their eyes and watch the games and see what's going on, and also have access that no fan or insider has into the program. Because I can't imagine what it actually looks like in terms of a day-to-day operation if this is how bad the product on the field is. It is a stunning amount of ineptitude at every level of this program if Sherrone Moore returns for another year. And I don't even care if all of a sudden Michigan goes 11-1 and we beat Ohio State next year. Cool. No one alive thinks that's a possibility. No one. Not a single soul that is capable of rational thought thinks Sherrone Moore is going to be able to turn this program around next year. So what's most likely going to happen next year is that we end up 6-6 or 7-5 again, with a schedule that's just as difficult this year as it is next year. Probably actually a little bit less difficult now that I think about it. We're swapping Texas for Oklahoma. However, Oklahoma has talent and a head coach that can actually coach football, which is not something we can say about Michigan. So even though this did kind of turn into a rant, and I said it wasn't going to, or at least it wasn't going to turn into a rant about the game, the reality is that I've been out on this team and I've been signaling the alarm since after Texas in the beginning of week 3. And it's pretty much gone the way I've expected it to go. If Sherrone Moore had lost to Michigan State, which was a definitive possibility, I genuinely think there would have been a real chance he got fired. But that game saved his job. Assuming Michigan beats Northwestern, which is an assumption. I don't know if they're going to beat Northwestern. Assuming Michigan beats Northwestern, Sherrone Moore has a job next year. And the bottom line is, it is my opinion that under no circumstances should he have that job next year. Moving on to the ass tier. These are two teams that played awful. Wisconsin and Nebraska. I'm going to start on the right here, actually, with Nebraska. Nebraska, you lost to UCLA. What's going to happen if you lose your last 3 games here? and you end up 5-7 again. Because that's not impossible to happen. You've got USC on the road, and USC at home has been a good football team this year. It's been on the road where they've struggled. And then you've got Wisconsin at home. I don't know if you can beat Wisconsin. And then you've got Iowa to end the year. And Iowa's a significantly better football team than you. So what are you going to do with Matt Rule, who I was never a believer in to begin with? If you end up 5-7 after being one win away from a bowl game in both seasons with multiple games left. Because that is a real possibility that could happen. Hell, it might even be the most likely outcome of these final 3 games is that you lose all of them. And I've always said that this is a team for next year. But at the time, I was thinking that they would beat UCLA. I was thinking that they would, be able to handle Illinois as well. And then that puts you on the track for 8 or 9 wins. Okay? Next year is now the year that you're probably looking at 8 or 9 wins. Because this year, you might not even make a bowl game. So maybe even my cautious optimism was still too optimistic about this football team and its future, potentially. So, yeah, I don't really know what to say about this team right now. The fact of the reality is that they're probably not a good team. Now, you got a bye week this week, but, it's whatever. You've got 2 weeks to prepare for USC. I'm still not sure that matters a whole lot. Moving on to Wisconsin, you got embarrassed by Iowa. Rivalry game. Couldn't even keep it close. I thought this team had turned a corner. Last 2 weeks have proven me wrong. Maybe you can win a game here against Nebraska or Minnesota to end the year. But there's a real possibility you also aren't making a bowl game in year 2 of your high-profile head coach. And I also want to remind you, as Wisconsin fans, you fired Paul Chryst because a 72% all-time winning percentage was not good enough. And you wanted to go back to what you were early on in the Chryst era when you were competing for Big Ten championships. So you decided to fire him for no fucking reason. So what are we doing now? Are we going to fire Luke Fickell after 2 years of dramatically underperforming? I don't know. But it might be a conversation you got to have if you lose these last 3 games here. Last 2 teams here before we get into the power rankings. This is the super ass tier. Teams that got embarrassed, in my opinion. Illinois and Michigan State. Now, I did predict Illinois to lose by a very similar margin to what they lost by, but I didn't think it would look the way that it looked. I was very disappointed with the level of play that Illinois put out on the field. I thought a 10-win season was a real possibility for this team, and hypothetically it still is with a bowl game, but 10-2 heading into the bowl game has a different level to it than 9-3 heading into the bowl game. Just like 10-3 losing in the bowl game feels a lot different than 10-3 winning in the bowl game. All in all, I've just been disappointed by this Illinois team the past few weeks. Now, I knew you weren't going to beat Oregon and Penn State, but Minnesota, a high-quality football team, really like what they're doing right now, should be a ranked football team with 2 less losses than they have. However, they did end up losing those games, so yes, Minnesota's very good. I thought that you would be able to compete at a higher level with them. That's generally my thoughts on that game. Michigan State started out real good, but it wasn't going to end well. And this game I was wrong about, even though I predicted Indiana to win. I was wrong about it because I thought it was going to be close. And this is a team that I just can't figure out right now. And I'm probably not going to figure it out before the end of the season. But this team right here, I don't know what it is. Childs has been playing better, but he's still not all the way there yet. And, maybe with the offseason can get it going, year 2 in the system and wide receivers and stuff like that. Maybe he can be better heading into next season. But this year is a lost cause. You still have a shot at a bowl game, which should be the goal. That has to happen in order for this team to, really have any sort of momentum heading into the season, because those extra 3 or 4 weeks of practice are going to do wonders for Adrian Childs and this football team. That is a big hurdle to get to if I'm going to be confident about this football team's chances next season. And it's not impossible, but I'm not particularly sure you do get there. So it is a little bit up in the air for me still, but all in all, I'm being patient with Jonathan Smith. I think generally speaking, this team looks better than I anticipated it being defensively, and a little bit worse than I thought it would be offensively. Moving on to the power rankings within the Big Ten here. Number 1 is still Oregon. Ohio State reclaims the number 2 spot. I've moved Indiana up to 3 for one simple reason. They are now ranked inside the top 10, meaning that if Indiana and Penn State played each other, Penn State would lose because James Franklin is going up against the top 10 opponent. At number 4, obviously Penn State. I still think they're a good team as long as they're not playing a top 10 ranked team. Minnesota up to number 5. And that might be a little bit of a hot take for some people, but I really like Minnesota. Iowa up to number 6. Really, really good football team right now, playing at a high level. Illinois down 2 spots to 7. Again, disappointed with the level of football they played. Washington at 8, beating USC at home. Don't really know what the rest of their season is going to look like, but right now they're looking pretty good. Wisconsin has disappointed me the last few weeks. Nebraska's been a disappointment for the vast majority of the season. Michigan and Michigan State are Michigan and Michigan State. Rutgers, by courtesy of having a bye week and not losing, moves up 1 spot to 13. Northwestern up 1 spot to 14. And USC down 2 spots to 15. The bottom 3 remain the same: UCLA, Maryland, and Purdue. Moving on to my top 15 rankings here. I have Oregon at number 1. Ohio State up 2 spots to number 2. Georgia down 1 spot to number 3, by courtesy of the fact that they struggled against a Florida team whose top 2 quarterbacks were hurt. Texas, by courtesy of Penn State losing, moves up 1 spot. Penn State down 2 spots to number 5. I mean, I don't really know where else to put them. Notre Dame is number 6. I think this is, at this point, becoming a rapidly underrated team in the college football landscape. Yes, they lost to Northern Illinois. This is not the same football team that it was coming off of a massive victory against a really good Texas A&M team. If they played that game again today, Notre Dame would win by 50 points. Tennessee at 7. They struggled in the first half, pulled away late. This is actually a football team that I really, really like. I think they're becoming underrated at this point. However, that very well could change. 2 weeks from now, they play Georgia at Georgia, and then they end the season on the road at Vanderbilt. And those are 2 difficult games that I would maybe even lean towards them losing. So they very well could end up with a 9-3 record. And if that happens, I don't particularly think that they're going to be in my final playoff rankings. Indiana up to number 8. They got Michigan this week. Then they have Ohio State. After Ohio State, they have Purdue, I believe. And this is a Indiana team that's staring down the barrel of 11-1 right now. And I really like this Indiana team. I think they are for real. I think if they win this week, they're a virtual lock to make the playoffs. Miami at number 9. I still think they're fake as fuck, but I am praying that Indiana ends up being the 8th seed and Miami ends up being the 9th seed, because that game would be absolute cinema. BYU at 10, they're probably flat out and straight up just the best team in the Big 12. However, SMU is giving them a run for their money. Boise State at this point is staring down a 12-1 record and being ranked inside the top 10 at the end of the season. LSU, by virtue of everybody else losing, has come up to number 12. SMU, by virtue of their only loss being to a top 10 BYU team and them just handling business the entire season, looks really, really good, ranked number 13. Alabama at 14, again, ranked there by default. Clemson at 15, again, kind of ranked there by default. I think there's a very, very clear cutoff after number 11, and kind of it's pretty much just whoever else you want to rank and in what order after that. My G5 pick, if not Boise State, is going to be Army. I think there's a very real possibility that they're going to run away with the American with a 12-0 record heading into Navy Week. Oh, wait, no, they played Notre Dame. Well, they might beat Notre Dame. I don't know, but they play Notre Dame. So probably not undefeated heading into Navy Week. They've probably got one loss, but that still should get them into the American Championship game, provided they can beat UTSA. They should beat North Texas here this week, and then they have a bye week heading into Notre Dame, and then they play UTSA in the final week of the regular season. Then, hypothetically, they would have Conference Championship week, and then they would have Navy to end the season. But that's just me, and what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. To this point, I'd like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagreed with me at any point, or you just have something to say, go ahead and drop a comment down in the comment section below. And now, with the outro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that is that I will see you next time.